Was on the Same Page program in 2014 that marked the FSM's 50th anniversary. As a Berkeley doctoral student, he helped organize the FSM's 20th anniversary, and he was a founder of Berkeley's TA and RA unions. This year, he is a senior fellow for the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and he recently published his latest book, Confronting Jim Crow. I'd now like to welcome Professor Cohen to offer the FSM overview.
Yeah! I don't know how you follow that. It's a hard act to follow. First of all, I want to thank the Free Speech Movement veterans on this panel, Bettina, Lynn Savio, and Jack Brady, and all the other FSM vets here and watching online for working so hard and sacrificing so much back in 1964 so the students and faculty on this campus could enjoy the right to freedom of speech. They were part of a student movement whose mass protests, exhilarating as they were, came at a price. Some FSM leaders endured suspension. Hundreds of FSMers who nonviolently sat in at Sproul Hall were arrested, tried, and convicted under mass trial. Most had to pay fines, but some, including FSM leaders Mario Savio and Bettina, were sentenced to considerable jail time. 45 days for Bettina, 120 days for Mario for engaging in civil disobedience. Lynn was given a choice between 30 days or a fine, while Jack, who in 1964 was a juvenile, spent 4 weekends at Lake Chabot Juvenile Correction Center, followed by 6 months of probation. In retrospect, it seems unjust, almost unbelievable that anyone should be jailed or fined for championing free speech on this campus. On the meeting of the FSM's cause, free speech, here are the thoughts that famed FSM Mario Savio shared on FSM's 30th anniversary. Dahomey said, "The most beautiful thing in the world is the freedom of speech." And those words, Mario said, are in me. They're burned in my soul. Because for me, freedom of speech was not a tactic, not something to win for political advantage. To me, freedom of speech represents the very dignity of what a human being is. That's what marks us off from the stones and the stars. You can speak freely. It's almost impossible for me to describe. It's the thing that marks us as just below the angels. For many FSMers, the free speech issue at Berkeley connected deeply with what they saw as the most important moral struggle going on in America back then. The crusade led by Black Americans to end Jim Crowism, anti-Black racial discrimination. It was on Berkeley's small free speech streets area on that sidewalk strip of Bancroft and Telegraph, just outside the campus entrance, that the students picked up leaflets that led them to participate with scores of their classmates in their first Bay Area civil rights demonstrations, the largest of which was Big Sit-In at the Sheraton Palace Hotel in March '64. A protest that pressured San Francisco's hotels to end their racially discriminatory hiring practices. Some students from Berkeley and other campuses went from such local activism in the spring semester to the far more dangerous civil rights work in the climate-infested Deep South, as volunteers in the SNCC-led Black Voting Rights Crusade in Mississippi Freedom Summer 1964. Very dangerous because almost a century of Black disenfranchisement was being challenged, and that was a big threat to the white power structure in Mississippi. This crusade made headlines in the summer of '64 when the tragic news broke that Freedom Summer volunteers Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman had been murdered by white supremacists. So when students returned to Berkeley for the 1964 fall semester and learned that the UC administration had mandated the closure of Cal's free speech area on that sidewalk strip, many saw this as an immoral act of political censorship, an attack on the student wing of the civil rights movement. After all, the road that led students to the Sheraton Palace and Mississippi often began on that strip of sidewalk on Bancroft and Telegraph. Invested as it was with the moral weight of the Black freedom struggle, Berkeley's free speech battle was one students felt deeply about from its beginning, because to keep faith with those who had put their lives on the line in Mississippi, they thought it urgent to preserve free speech at Cal, so other students could learn about and join the crusade against racism, both in the South and here in the Bay Area. Mario Savio, who was a Freedom Summer volunteer, believed that many of his fellow Berkeley students, even if they had not gone south, were so sympathetic to that anti-racist crusade that they had vicariously gone to Mississippi. They and most of their classmates treasured Berkeley's free speech area with its political literature and activists staffing their organizations' card tables, recruiting for all kinds of causes. The students saw that political space as an important part of their education, giving them access to information on the latest causes from left to right, unavailable in most classes or in the unfree high schools from which many had graduated. A lot of high schools had restrictions on free speech, some still do. The nobility of the free speech clause and its links to the Black freedom struggle helped the FSM achieve a strong and growing popularity on campus. But the FSM proved deeply unpopular off campus. A January 1965 poll found that 74% of Californians disapproved of the free speech movement. 74%. This might seem surprising, but America has usually been a culturally conservative society that dislikes student movements, viewing the proper role of young people as deferring to their elders, obeying the rules, not questioning authority, and above all, not upsetting the status quo. Like many Americans who scoff that politically vocal athletes like LeBron James should shut up and play, much of the public in the FSM days thought students should shut up and study. Public opinion polls showed that the majority of Americans also disapproved of the Southern Black students' lunch counter sit-ins against Jim Crowism in 1960. The majority of Americans opposed the Freedom Rides and the student anti-war movement during the Vietnam era. The FSM's unpopularity was fanned and exploited by red-baiting newspaper columnists and by politicians and business leaders who spoke of the Berkeley riots, even though the FSM was a nonviolent movement. Perhaps the worst lie spread by the FSM detractors was that students were lawless rebels, simply out to cause trouble, and they had no valid grievances. Ronald Reagan, in his dishonest campaign speeches in his 1967 race for the governorship, which he ran by landslide, generated wild applause on that campaign trail when he announced Berkeley's so-called free speech advocates, who in truth, he said, have no appreciation for freedom at all. The ringleaders of this assault on law and order should have been, in Reagan's words, taken by the scuff of the neck and thrown out of the university once and for all. And Reagan's violent rhetoric would only escalate during his term as governor, when in 1970 he said of beating back the student movement, if it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement. UC President Clark Kerr, unlike the right-wing Reagan, was an establishment liberal and in many respects a democratic educational leader who was interested in democratic access to education. But nonetheless, Kerr shared Reagan's view that the FSM was not an admirable free speech crusade. Free speech, Clark Kerr claimed, was a phony slogan. And according to President Kerr, UC had allowed, quote, full free speech prior to the FSM's emergence. Echoed for decades by the FSM's detractors, this claim appeared just a few weeks ago in a Wall Street Journal op-ed announcing the FSM on its 60th anniversary. All you need is a glance at the political geography of Berkeley in 1964 to see that these claims about free speech being a phony issue are false. Cal had a major free speech problem long before it closed down the free speech area on the Bancroft Strip that September. Note that this free speech area was not on campus, but off, just outside the campus entrance. So one had to go beyond the jurisdiction of the repressive UC administration to enjoy the First Amendment right to engage in political advocacy. This had been the case at Cal since 1934. Back then, amidst a Bay Area Red Scare sparked by the San Francisco General Strike and the West Coast Waterfront Strike, the UC administration banned political activism on campus, pushing it outside the campus. So Cal's free speech area in the 30s and 40s was just beyond Sailor Gate. And that tradition of having free speech only right off the campus was in fact known as the Sailor Gate tradition. In the late 50s, when the campus expanded, the free speech area moved to the Bancroft Strip, so it would remain off campus. This meant that for decades, until the free speech movement came along, there was more free speech off campus than on, which doesn't speak well of the state of free speech at Berkeley prior to the FSM. Some of Cal's free speech violations in these earlier years occurred covertly. The Sproul administration worked with Northern California district attorneys and police to assemble an intelligence network monitoring leftist Berkeley students in the Depression decade. During the Cold War era, UC administrators secretly sought to blacklist radical students, including The late Leon Litwack, my future Cal professor and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, seeking to bar him from being admitted as a student to the teacher education program at Cal because of his leftist politics. But UC most grievously eroded free speech and academic freedom during a second Red Scare, wrought by the Cold War, imposing on its employees an anti-communist loyalty oath more appropriate to a police state than to a great university, leading to the firing of more than 2,000 faculty, the largest purge of dissenting faculty in Cold War America. Cal was a campus that for decades banned communists from speaking on campus, including his father, speaking in the history department, had to go off campus. And in 1959, President Kerr imposed these Kerr directives that even barred the student government from taking positions on off-campus political issues. And that led to what student activists called sandbox politics. Given this grim history, it's not surprising that UC's administration caved when in 1964, a turbulent presidential election year, Bay Area business leaders, state legislators, and right-wing newspapers pressured UC to clamp down on its student protesters. The Berkeley students sitting at racially discriminatory hotels and employers in the spring of '64, their picketing of the Republican convention in the summer of '64, and other civil rights pickets, and infuriated these powerful interests. And some of Cal's own administrators were furious about it too. When an Oakland Tribune reporter discovered that the plaques embedded in the sidewalk on Bank and Telegraph indicated that part of that strip was on campus property, the administration in mid-September '64 jumped at the chance to ban political advocacy there, shutting down the free speech area that was treasured by Berkeley students. The free speech area's closure ignited student protest via a united front composed of student organizations from left to right. First came polite negotiations with the dean. Then it was clear when she lacked the power to restore the free speech area, students defied the ban, setting up their political advocacy tables on Sproul Plaza. When the administration escalated by citing for disciplinary action the first students who staffed those tables, hundreds of students signed a petition of complicity, saying that they too had violated the ban and staffed those tables. On September 30th, this student solidarity continued as hundreds of students showed up at the dean's office with the cited students, demanding that the dean meet with them all, not just with those few students who had been cited for disciplinary action. When the dean refused to meet with them all, the first Berkeley sit-in began and lasted late into the night. This was when Mario Savio emerged as the movement's key spokesperson, debating the deans, refuting their claims that UC was politically neutral, indicting the free speech ban, and the undemocratic mode of decision-making that had yielded such repression. Witnessing Savio's speech and the dean's inability to convincingly defend their position after Mario critiqued it, David Lance Freund concluded, "Had I been in the shoes of the administration, I would have trembled at this oratory and carefully examined my motives and what I hoped to gain and what I stood to lose. This is not the speech of fractious, willful children deprived of a glittering toy. This is a speech of Americans who dressed up in war paint and threw tax tea into Boston Harbor." The next day, UC's administration, following a divide and conquer strategy, enacted its plan to arrest a non-student who violated the ban. So at noon on October 1st, 1964, as thousands of students poured out to Sproul, coming out of their classes heading for lunch, they saw a Congress of Racial Equality activist, Jack Weinberg, a former math graduate student, being arrested for violating the free speech ban. As a veteran civil rights organizer, Jack went limp, slowing down his arrest as police dragged him into their squad car in Sproul Plaza. In those moments, someone, we don't know exactly who, or a lot of people claim it was them, shouted, "Sit down!" And the first dozens, then hundreds of students sat down, forming a nonviolent blockade around the car. Mario Savio removed his shoes, climbed up and stood atop the car, using it as a platform to explain the protest to the growing crowd of furious students. This began a 32-hour car top rally where speaker after speaker, women, including Bettina, and men from the roof that blockaded a police car denounced the restrictions on free speech, probed the meaning of freedom, its importance for a university, and discussed ways to win free speech for a university. Reflecting back on that moment, when he first climbed atop the police car, Mario explained, "When I do something I feel is a little bit questionable, a little bit risky," getting atop the police car, a little bit risky, "my heart beats faster. I wouldn't have been surprised if people had hooted me down. I had some feelings of embarrassment. I took my shoes off. I didn't want to hurt the car, but it had a kind of poetic rightness to it. Sometimes you're just gripped by the moment and you have a feel for what's poetically right. What was correct? Free speech or police taking away this person who was sitting at a political advocacy table? It was a question of what thing would prevail. What deserved contempt and what deserved praise? You sometimes feel those things. Summarizing those stirring 32 hours, when one idealistic free speech advocate after another spoke from atop the blockaded car, historian Rick Perlstein wrote, Boston Harbor, Harper's Ferry, Omaha Beach. This time the stand for freedom would be made from atop a dented police car's roof. The blockade and car top rally generated headlines and paved the way for a semester of nonviolent protest, mass organizing, negotiations, civil disobedience, a TA strike, and administration overreach that in December culminated in the FSM winning over the faculty, sealing the movement's free speech victory. That's 1 cent somewhere. And this victory came on December 8, 1964, when the faculty overwhelmingly voted for the December 8th resolution that the university should stop regulating the content of speech on campus. And I just want to end by saying that this protest, that rally, very symbolic of both the FSM and all the freedom movements of the 60s. Think of it, the protesters atop the police car, liberty over order. That's what that symbolized. And as historian Carl Shorsky explained, and by the way, that's also why Reagan and conservatives were so upset about it. As Carl Shorsky, the historian, explained, those whose basic concern was with order were always favored over those primarily concerned with freedom. It was much like the civil rights movement, where protest marches and sit-ins were illegal, but fundamental to the realization of new freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. And with that said, I'd like to now pass it over to our student moderator for the evening, Emma Tang.
Hello everyone, my name is Emma. I'm a senior at Berkeley studying biology, undergraduate, part of the Berkeley Forum. Bettina, Jack, Lynn, thank you all so much for being here tonight. It's really a pleasure to have you here at the forum. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that we'll have an audience Q&A at the end of the event, so if you think of a question for our speakers, please save it for them. I'd like to start off the conversation with some introductions. So starting with Jack, could you all give a brief overview of your role in the free speech movement and who you were from a personal perspective?
I was a 17-year-old freshman out of Merced High School. I came up to Cal by accident. I had applied to a number of colleges because my family expected me to go to college after high school and been turned down by many, but I was accepted by Cal because I had pretty good grades. And I was thinking maybe I'd go to Kitsap Junior College until I was picked up hitchhiking going up to Seattle that summer, and the guy said, "What are you going to do, kid?" And I told him, I had 2 colleges I might go to, and he said, "Go to Cal. Whatever you're interested in, there'll be a lot of people there who'll be interested in it, and that won't be true at Kitsap." So I came up and got involved, and I found everything that I wanted as soon as the first picket line went up. That was what I was here for. And so during the free speech movement, I just worked. Lee Felsenstein has said there were 3 groups of us. The Apollinarians, who gave speeches, talked about philosophy, the Dionysians, who partied, and the Hephaestians. And the Hephaestians, I work, therefore I am. If there's something to be done, I'll do it. And we have a whole row of them sitting right there. That's who I was.
So that's marvelous. The first thing I wanted to say, very formally on behalf of the 3 of us and Robbie and the whole Free Speech Movement Archive board, is to formally thank the Berkeley Forum for putting this together. And Emma and Nikki and everyone who's been involved, I want to say that it's been an inspiration for us, and we are so grateful. So thank you. Thank you very much. So my very brief opening was, I was born and raised in a communist family. My mother was a union organizer, and my father was a prominent historian of African American history and described by the New York Times as the Communist Party's Marxist theoretician. So I was born in '44, and World War II was not yet over. So we were in the shadow of that war and the Holocaust. And so I was steeped in anti-fascist, anti-war, civil rights politics from a very, very, very young age. And I went on the first March on Washington for Civil Rights that was organized in the summer of 1957, primarily by the NAACP in response to the awful lynching of Emmett Till that happened in 1955, for those of you that know about that terrible lynching of Emmett Till in Mississippi in 1955. And they organized the first March on Washington in '57. I was 13, went by myself on a bus. I arrived in Berkeley at 18 in 1962, thinking I would be a pre-med major. It didn't work out because I was so involved in politics and I couldn't study properly to be a pre-med major. I had already joined the Communist Party, and I was a member of a socialist student youth organization called the W.E.B. Du Bois Clubs, named after Dr. Du Bois. And my job with the Du Bois Club was to set up our table. So that's what I did, and that's why I got cited by the teens. I just sort of wandered into this. And then, so I became part of that protest and all of the things that Robbie has already described. And and I was, of course, I sat down around the police car, just as that has been described. And my first speech was from the top of the police car because Mario and Art Goldberg told me to get up there and say something. So I got up there, I took my shoes off, like they did, and I went up there, and I don't remember everything I said, but it was at night, and the television lights were in my eyes, so I couldn't really see the audience. But I remember that I quoted Frederick Douglass, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And then there was this roar from the students in front of me, and my whole body just went like that, and I was hooked. I really wanted free speech. And so then I just wanted to say that, that the settlement, there was negotiations, and we let the police car go, and Jack was arrested, but charges were not pressed, and so forth. Anyway, after that weekend, during that weekend, while we were organizing what became the Free Speech Movement, Clark Kerr announced that 49% of the demonstrators were communists. And so that was in the San Francisco Examiner, it was a front page headline. And I remember being at the meeting, and I remember Mario slapping his knee with glee and saying, "I know, Bettina's going to speak at the next rally on Monday, and we'll throw the real communists out." That's who I was then. I was 20.
I was a transfer student from the East, and I was in my final semester as an English major. I was a pink diaper baby. Does anybody need that explained? I was born just before the war. My parents had been members of the Young People's Socialist League, YPSL, and their friends were still old lefties. And despite their inactivity, they still maintained their interest in the news and politics. Their perspective was roughly that of Bernie Sanders, give or take a few issues. I absorbed their vision and their ideas at the dinner table, but I had an aversion to the ideological politics of the late 50s, and I stayed almost totally away from any causes or political groups. But in February 1960, 4 black college students were attacked when they sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And like thousands of other students, their dignity, who were captivated by their dignity and courage and moved, I experienced that same thing. At my college, we raised bail money and picketed the local Woolworths in support of their struggle. And when I transferred to Cal, I followed the news of both the national and local civil rights movements, but I felt too overloaded with schoolwork to do more than participate occasionally. I couldn't join Freedom Summer because I had to work, but I was gripped by the long, fruitless search for the 3 missing civil rights workers. And when their corpses were discovered, with James Chaney's having been badly beaten, I felt grief and also what I can only call survivor's guilt. Mario had actually been to Mississippi, but as Robbie pointed out, many of us had been there vicariously. So when the battle for the Bancroft Strip began, I was very ready to be involved. When the table sitters were cited, I signed the statement of complicity, and with about 300 other people, kept their appointment to see the dean. The next day, I watched Jack Weinberg, as we had planned, refuse to identify himself, go limp, and be put in a campus police car. When the spontaneous call to sit down rang out, without hesitation, I sat, and I stayed. Which led to my spending the rest of the semester as one of the FSM troops, one of those needed bodies, and also serving as editorial coordinator of a large crew of student researchers for what became known as the Rossman Report, an almost legendary anthology of documents formally entitled Administrative Pressures and Student Political Activity at the University of California. Conceived by Michael Rossman and informally known with his name, it exploded the myth of UC as a free speech haven. And I would say more about it, but I've run out of time.
Thank you guys so much for your something that's apparent in all of your introductions is that this history is not just a collection of facts, it's really your personal life and your thought process and your ethics, and it's something that has followed you throughout life. And so with that in mind, we wanted to ask you about the movement itself and moments that you felt were crucial. So first question will be directed towards Lynn. And the Free Speech Movement is an event that spanned 2 semesters, requiring members to negotiate university policy, settle internal conflicts, organize events, and navigate arrests. What, in your opinion, do you feel was the most pivotal moment of the FSM?
Well, I think actually there were 3 pivotal moments. The first one, and the most important, was the sit-in around the car, because that turned us from a small group of protesters and picketers into a mass movement. And it got people excited, it got people committed, it got people energized and working in whatever way they could. And so that's the central event. But there were others, and the 2 that really spring to mind, because like the car sit-in, they are examples of how the administration, when we were down lowest, when we thought all is lost, the administration would do an inconceivably stupid thing from their own point of view. I mean, who brings a police car onto the middle of the campus at the noon hour with thousands of students around? The other two events were when when we had sort of lost on the issue of being punished by the university with the camp, if we did something illegal, if you advocated something illegal on campus, even if it wasn't illegal what you advocated, if it turned out that the demonstration people got arrested, and then you could be punished by the university, disciplined for having advocated a legal action that resulted in an illegal behavior. So it was a kind of a hard concept to explain to masses of students. And a lot of people felt that you have achieved so much. You've gotten the right to recruit members, to advocate, to collect money. Let's stop. We don't need to do this. And it looked like we had a sit-in with a couple of hundred students, and finally split up and decided not to get arrested. We left, but it was a disaster. What did the administration do at this moment? They send out letters over the vacation punishing 8 students for actions that had taken place 2 months before that we had thought had been settled by everything that had happened since that time. So we were furious, and we went on with this principle that it's all of us or none, you know. We all did this, so cite everybody. And that's what triggered the FSM, the Sproul Hall sit-in. But there was one more place where we could lose, and that was when Clark Kerr talked with Robert Scalapino, the chair of the political science department, and got all the department chairs, the most conservative faculty group on campus, and they came to a decision that would settle the matter. I don't even remember what the terms of their decision was, but we were all invited to enter the Greeks Theater. They're all seated on the chair. Kerr gets up, and Scalapino gets up and gives the way that the department chairs have decided to settle this issue. And Kerr dismisses the meeting, and as planned, Bettina encourages Mario to go ahead, and he walks slowly down the aisle and steps onto the podium. The meeting has been adjourned now, and immediately before he opens his mouth, he's grabbed by campus cops around his neck and pushed to the ground. And, you know, before, 20,000 students, there was an uproar. It was like, the minute it happened, Clark Kerr said, we've lost. He knew, you know, and so I think any of those 3 moments could have gone a different way, and we were lucky. They were stupid, we were lucky.
I think especially it's worth emphasizing the initial police car sit-in, because that was the point. Like, I had been the lone weirdo in each high school I'd been in. I'd been in 4 different ones. I made trouble, but nobody else did. And I came up to Cal, and I didn't know anybody or anything. And the United Front, it was called then, had started in protesting these restrictions, but it still seemed a relatively small amount of people. until that police car came out there and people sat down around it and more, and suddenly, I wasn't the only weirdo making trouble. There was hundreds of and thousands of us. And all of us saw that. And all the people sitting down there were not the politicals. It was everyone who had been watching the civil rights movement grow during their whole time growing up and feeling as American citizens, it's our responsibility to do something to support the Constitution and democracy and rights. I mean, that's what we're taught as kids, you know? We're supposed to be American patriots. And you don't just do that by saying it, you do it by doing it and at your own risk if necessary. The people behind the wall at Lexington and Concord were not organized or sent out there by anybody. They knew it needed to be done and did it, and we did the same thing. But that was the moment we realized we're not alone. Why, there's thousands of us. We can actually do this, and we knew how to do it.
Right. I just want to add one other I think crucial moment, and Lynn is absolutely right about Mario wanted to rush the stage, and I said to him, don't run, because I was afraid they'd tackle him if he ran. Of course, they tackled him and he didn't run, so what do I know? But the thing I wanted to say was that moment on the stage shifted the dynamic in the faculty. And so December 8th, which is the next day, the more radical faculty who had been organizing were able to talk to their colleagues in a different way, and they presented the resolution before the Academic Senate, which has already, I think Robbie talked about it. And I wanted to just describe for a moment the scene. There were thousands of us outside Wheeler Auditorium, and the faculty was inside, and they were speaking. And it was for or against a resolution supporting the demands of the free speech movement. And they spoke with extraordinary eloquence. It was extraordinary eloquence. Of course, there were some that opposed, but you could tell from the tenor of the comments and the things that were being said that there was a passion in the support. And then the vote came, and we were outside, and they had been broadcasting the speeches to us. There were microphones set up. You know, that old oak tree was glistening in the moonlight, and we were quiet. And they announced the vote. It was Scalapino as the chair of the Senate. He said 824 in favor and 115 opposed. And that's a tremendous majority. And then the faculty filed out of out of Wheeler, and we parted and made an aisle for them and started applauding in unison. And I will tell you, they were almost all white, and they were all male, except there was one woman professor, Anna Pitkin, in political science. And many of those old men were weeping. And I think they were weeping because at that moment they knew that the McCarthy terror had been killed.
I should add, as those of you who were there remember, we were all weeping too.
Yes, we were. This is true.
And you know,
But Jacobus Tenbrook,
I get misty-eyed now thinking about it.
Professor Tenbrook, the blind professor of rhetoric, who had led the fight, been our strongest ally from the beginning, he came out and he picked up his cane and he waved it over his head like that, and we went absolutely crazy. It was wonderful.
Thank you guys so much. It's really moving to hear your anecdotes. But we talked a lot about the past, but a lot of the free speech movement and the tactics and techniques that were used then are still very applicable today to student activists. And some key characteristics of the free speech movement include, as you guys talked about, non-violence, but non-compliant enough to be arrested, and also a participatory democracy where there's no one main leader, but and so how are these kinds of tactics and techniques still applicable to students today? And we can start with Jack.
There were a number of things that made it work for us. And one was we were I've noticed that there's patterns in fashions in student or other general activism. We got our education from watching the civil rights movement and understood, nonviolence was understood not just by the hardcore activists, but everybody knew what it was about. We never had to enforce a discipline. Everybody knew. One person, one activist, tried to agitate people to attack the police and free Jack from the car. And when the police arrested him and took him away, people in our crowd applauded the police, okay? Because we understood, no, we don't want to get in fights. We're nonviolent, and we stick with that. We don't think we're going to win by the force of our macho. We don't think we're going to win by the force of our righteousness. You know, we are right. There may not be many of us, but we're right anyway, so we don't need to talk to anybody else. You know, if you aren't on our side, it's because you're no good, you know. And so all we need to do is denounce you, and we'll just go ahead with our action. But we didn't do that. Partly because we had to be a coalition. We represented the interests of the entire spectrum on campus and of all students, really. It was our rights being taken away. We had to stay democratic. We had to stay fairly open, and we had to win the support of the entire campus community, and that was never exactly stated. Seems to be cutting in and out. But we all knew it was what we had to do, that we would win by convincing people. So even when we went in for our big climax sit-in, where it was so important to get as many people as possible inside, from our platform, on our microphone, we had the president of the ASUC, who was opposed to us, give a speech against the sit-in, because we believed we were not going to tell people this is what you have to do. We were going to make our case. We want to convince you. And there are other arguments against us, but we think our arguments are good, so you will agree with us. But you can hear the others, we'll tell you what they are. What else? We also listened, which was real important. The free speech movement had its executive committee made up of representatives of all the groups. And each one of those went back to their groups and heard what the groups had to say. And each one of us lived in a living unit somewhere and went to classes and were part of, and we talked to everybody. Everybody talked about this every day during the entire free speech movement. And we listened. We heard when people said, okay, that's what you're planning next week? I don't think that's right. You know, you're going off, flying off the handle. You guys need to slow down a bit, because I'm not convinced that's the right thing to do. And we could bring this back to the executive committee, who could pass it on to the steering committee, so we didn't get out of touch. We didn't just listen to our own voices. Finally, last item, we reached out all over the place for allies, to the religious community, to the labor movement, to the political parties, including the Republicans. We didn't have a plug there, but we reached. And we made, internationally, all over the place, we solicited support and got them to pressure against the university, so that we had the massive amount of force built up. And when they made their misstep, we had the power to smash them and win. We never lost track of the point that what we were trying to do was win our goal. Not just be right and go down fighting, but to win. And we did it.
I think I'll just pick up on a couple of points. I agree with them. I mean, we're all on the same page here about how we organized and the ways in which we tried to practice a democratic movement and also a nonviolent movement. What I wanted to say was the victory of the free speech movement enabled the anti-war movement in the United States. The first teach-in, and so there was a cascading effect. Once the regents passed a resolution December 14th that said that henceforth their regulations would not go beyond the First and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. And that guaranteed that there would be the same freedom of speech on campus as there was off campus, which was the principle that we were fighting for. Now, once that happened, there was a cascade of similar actions by administrators and boards of trustees and so forth all over the country. And I can tell you this because Mario and I and others went on tour after the free speech movement in December. ABC paid for our way, and then we stopped wherever we could across the country. And we didn't have to say a word. We came onto the stage, and there were thousands of people, students in the audiences, and they cheered us. They just were cheering because there was this momentum, there was this feeling of the victory of what it represented. So the first teach-ins against the war in Vietnam were held at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And you may remember that one was held here in May of 1965. It opened the door to educating the students, all of us, about what was happening in Vietnam and where it was even, and why there was a war and the U.S. complicity in it and so on. And that kind of thing is what the sort of the momentum that the free speech movement built all the way to the Paris in '68 when the students almost overthrew the de Gaulle government, and to Prague also in the spring of 1968, the pro-democracy movement. They were all infused in various ways, encouraged in various ways. So I just wanted to point that out. And of course, there's movements happening now, which we can talk about, but I'm just referring to those things that happened in the immediate aftermath of the free speech movement, of what it enabled. And the other thing it enabled, that's because it guaranteed freedom of speech, was the establishment of Third World College here at Berkeley, and the establishment of an ethnic studies at San Francisco State. And that was a crucial change that then brought about a whole cascade again of changes in the compositions of the student body and the faculty for the first time. So it had this kind of effect that was very positive, I think, overall.
Yeah, I just want to add. Go ahead. I wanted to add one more thing about leadership, because I think that was an extremely important aspect that made the FSM a very successful movement. And we believed in structure, and we believed in leadership, and we believed in participatory democracy. And leadership and participatory democracy were not contradictory. And so we had a big structure. We had an executive committee which was pretty representative of the political groups. I don't know how much people went back to their organizations and got advice and consulted with them and stuff, but that was the theory in any way. And then we had a steering committee that was, had to report to the executive committee, and their actions about decisions, their day-to-day decisions, had to be okayed by the executive committee. And then, in the end, people voted with their feet. You had to receive the okay of the masses, because if you didn't, they weren't going to show up. They weren't going to picket or do what you wanted them to do. So it was extremely democratic, and for the most part, I would say, there were moments when, things slipped through. But when we looked at a movement like Occupy, which in some ways was just mind-blowing for the country and had a tremendous effect. But if you have, you got to have everybody who wants to talks for how long they want to talk, forever, and there's nobody's taking any responsibility for anything. So you have to have some kind of structure and leadership thing when you do a movement if you want it to be successful. At least that's my opinion.
Great. Thank you guys so much for your answers. I have a question for Bettina. In your answer, the free speech movement has had a legacy and still has a legacy where it led to the anti-Vietnam War protests and also formation of the ethnic studies departments at Berkeley and elsewhere. And it's still having an impact on Berkeley as a school where student activism is a very strong aspect of the community. In the past year, college campuses have seen an influx of protests and encampments in response to the mass displacement and killing of civilians in Palestine. Considering recent UC-wide policy on restrictions of time, place, and manner, what, if at all, do you think students should demand from the university in terms of their free speech rights?
Okay. Well, yes, so there have been, and you know, I do want to, there have been these mass encampments. They have been nonviolent. I want to emphasize that. They have not instigated violence, and they have, I think you're familiar with the encampments. There was one here in Berkeley. There was one at UC Santa Cruz where I work. There was one at NYU, Columbia, Dartmouth. So I can name a whole slew of campuses across the country, University of Oregon.
UCLA and Davis.
And UCLA, yes.
And
UC Irvine and others of the UC. So what I want to say about it is, well, there's a number of things that can be said. But first of all, the horror of the deaths that have taken place. First, I acknowledge the deaths of the people in Israel on October 7th. I think that's important to acknowledge. And the ongoing occupation of the Palestinian people that's been going on for decades. And so you have this terrible, terrible situation, awful violence, and of course the deaths now of over 40,000, I think it's up to 45,000 Palestinians, and now the bombing in Lebanon. Now the encampments took place before the current the current bombings in Lebanon, so I'll just leave that. I'm just stating that that's going on. So a lot of the students that were involved in the encampments were Jewish. That's one thing I want to emphasize. They were not all, so a lot of the Jewish students were involved in protests. The Jewish community is divided. I think that's an important thing to point out. There's not unanimity, but there are very wealthy Jewish people in this country who are very conservative and very pro-Israel, who have pressured administrations, and I feel personally as a Jew, unconscionable ways to prevent them from allowing the students to conduct what are peaceful protests and forms of encampment. That's the first thing I emphasize. Then I think the other thing is that here at Berkeley, your chancellor, the chancellor here at Berkeley, was a model of free speech in that she did not try to use the police to close down the encampment. In fact, she negotiated with the students. She was a very strong supporter of the concepts of the free speech movement and successfully negotiated a settlement which included investigating the university's complicity in funding military support for Israel. And that's what the students were after. And I really admire her for that. When she was doing that, the regent said to her, "You use the police or we're going to fire you." And she reminded them that she was already announced her retirement. So go ahead. So she called their bluff, so to speak. On the other hand, in campuses like UCLA, they allowed anti-encampment protesters to come in and commit terrible violence against those who were in the encampment. And the police did nothing for more than, I think, a couple of hours before they intervened, and then they ended up arresting the people that were part of the encampment. That was really outrageous. So I could go on with things, but I also wanted to point out one other thing. So at NYU, which I know something about because I'm good friends with Robbie, and he was very involved in speaking about free speech issues while the encampment was going on at NYU. The students set up, it was a completely nonviolent, it was an encampment, and the first thing they did, because of the dates of when the encampment started, the Jewish students organized a Seder. And then they used the Seder as an occasion for discussion among all the students who were there, whatever their religious or non-religious affiliation, to talk about issues of freedom and liberation. And the same thing happened at Columbia. They also did a Seder. So the point, I think you can see the point I'm trying to make is I think the students were admirable in what they were trying to do. And I think the last thing, in the interest of time, I mean, I could go on, I want to point out that the former head of Jewish studies at Dartmouth was a professor of labor studies, went out, she's 60 years old, Annalise Orlick is her name, she went out to observe the beginning of what was going to be an encampment, and the police grabbed her cell phone, knocked her to the ground, she stood up, grabbed her cell phone back, they knocked her down again, she got up again, they knocked her down again, and then they arrested her. And at Dartmouth, they didn't even allow the encampment to get started. That's not the United States. That should not have been allowed here. And I greatly admire, but my point is she was Jewish. She was a Jewish professor who had headed Jewish studies at Dartmouth. So any idea that the encampments are inherently anti-Semitic or something like that, that's not true. They're not. All right. I think it's important to say that. There may be some anti-Semitic slogans, yes, but the heart of these protests are not anti-Semitic. And finally, I want to say shame on President Drake for his new regulations that time, place, and manner kill freedom. He has time, place, and manner freedom of speech to death. And I think that it's very, very unfortunate that he has done this and caved to a certain kind of pressure. Thank you.
I don't want to sound like Grandpa telling the kids to get off the lawn, but I have a little problem with encampments. I said before that protests tend to follow fashions, and you know the statement about generals learning how to win the last war, but never ready for the next one. We were trained by the civil rights movement by observing it, you know, and learned tactics and the techniques. And after a while, we got so confident in our numbers, we thought our sheer macho would go out and win the fight in the street with the cops. And during the Vietnam War, we got considerably less nonviolent. And this was in all number of theaters of combat, politics. And then it got worse when people saw the black bloc stuff in Europe and thought that's what you know, this is a demonstration, you put on a mask and you go get your, you know, bottles to throw and we'll go down there and have a demonstration, because that's how they're done, right? And then after Occupy Wall Street, when people think, okay, we're gonna have a protest, get your tents, where do we go? And I find a problem with encampments. When we occupied Sproul Hall, we had intention to hold it for 3 days, no more. That was when the Academic Senate was going to meet. We were going to walk out and walk to them. We were not planning to hold Sproul Hall to the death. With an encampment, and with Occupy Wall Street particularly, it seemed that a win would happen when Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein walked down to Zuccotti Park and handed over the keys and the code to the computer and said, okay, you win, you know, we're done. And that wasn't going to happen. So you were holding until when? And an encampment requires people to stay there 24 hours a day. Most people can't do that. It selects out. It separates you from those others who are not encamping. If you have a whole system of hand signals that you have to learn and new words for everything, it limits the number of people who can be involved. Once you have an encampment, you suddenly have new requirements. Instead of reaching out to the people out there that you need to convince, you are reaching in to figure out how to govern the encampment, how to have curfews, how to provide the food, how to do the security, how to do it. And you're not doing your basic purpose, which is outreach to the people you want to convince to make your demonstration bigger. You're certainly not doing that at 2 in the morning when you're sleeping in your tent. You could be sleeping at home comfortably, come back the next day, and be there in the same spot, better rested. And so all I'm calling for is not an end to encampments, nor condemning them, because they are courageous, they are effective in spotlighting an issue, but they need to be rethought, I believe, and more creativity and tactics, which I know you folks can come up with, I highly recommend. And stay off the damn lawn.
Thank you guys for your responses. I have another question directed towards any of you guys that would like to answer. In addition to the war protests this past year, there have been other protests at Berkeley, namely in 2017, when there was a series of right-wing speakers that came to Berkeley, including Milo Yiannopoulos. They attempted to speak, and in response to Yiannopoulos' often racist and hateful views, Berkeley protesters caused $100,000 of damages to campus property and also eventually forced an event cancellation. So my question to you is, do all views have a place in universities? And how do we reconcile upholding free speech with safety, whether physical or mental?
I have some thoughts. I have some thoughts on this, but I don't have the real solution. Do all views have validity? I think that attacking individuals by name or by racial groups or by religious groups or whatever is illegitimate. It's not a discussion of ideas or of politics or anything. It's just insulting in order to try and enrage. But I also feel that destroying property is not a useful tactic or a valid tactic. And I was not in favor during the Vietnam War of the people who burst into classrooms and interrupted the lecture, you know, to give us a screed against the war, because there were classes going on. There may be moments when it is, you know, necessary to do something like that, but on the whole, I think those are illegitimate tactics. And doing things where you're trying to win by being by being violent, by overwhelming them with your force, is crazy, because they always have more force than you. You know, you can never beat them, and it's like the world is, do we destroy each other by who can exert the most physical power over each other? And I don't think it's the way that left-wing political movements should behave, just as I don't think it's the way that US or Israel or Germany or whatever should behave. You've got to be trying to reach people on a higher level than I'm bigger than you and my daddy's bigger than you and we can beat you up. Anyway.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to, in response to this question, point out that in May of 1965, members of the American Nazi Party picketed this campus at the entrance with signs denouncing the free speech movement, and in particular a sign that said, "Burn Aptaker." I don't know how many of you remember that, but it's rather sharp in my memory. And when I went to inquire about this from various authorities, I was told that the speech was protected because it did not present a clear and present danger to my safety. Now, I think that was true. In other words, no one, certainly in this environment, was going to attack me in that moment. I had many death threats and all kinds of things over the years, but you understand what I'm saying? The Justice Holmes decision on freedom of speech is you curtail or you can stop freedom of speech if it presents a clear and present danger. So now to the speeches of Yiannopoulos and other right-wing people, does their speech present, is it offensive? Yes. Is it racist? Yes. Okay? Is it whatever? Yes. But the question is, does it present a clear and present danger to the safety of the people in a community? Now, you can debate this because, for example, racist speech has been tolerated in this country for decades. People say racist things all the time, and their speech is not curtailed. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. You have to think about the law as far as I can understand it, and what presents a clear and present danger, however offensive, however anti-democratic the views may be. I think the other thing is, there are so many ways to protest the speaker that do not involve violence. For example, you can come in and hold up a sign. You can come in and turn your back on the speaker. You can come in and walk out in mass. There are many nonviolent tactics that can be used to oppose these views. You can also leaflet and take the text of what somebody is saying and oppose it. But I think the use of violence trying to shut down speakers is a mistake. And I think it was very unfortunate that this happened in Berkeley. I remember it very, very clearly. I was opposed to it at the time. And I don't think it's an effective way of dealing. You also then alienate a lot of students who are afraid to come out because they don't want to get hurt. And so I think you can always use other more creative tactics to oppose such speech.
Amen. And it's about respect. The whole notion of the free speech movement was this is a place to exchange ideas. We happen to like our ideas better than some other ideas. And if we like them enough, we have confidence in them so that other ideas can be heard and higher ideas can be heard alongside and weighed, and we'll come out ahead. But if we're saying, no, those are wrong ideas, so you got to shut up, deplatform them, shut down their meeting, disrupt it with hecklers, disrupt it by breaking the windows and lighting things, what does that do? That shows total disrespect for the people to whom that speech is given to be able to evaluate it and say, that guy's full of crap. I don't need you to tell me that. I just heard it. He's full of crap. By going in there and trying to violently break it up, that was, when you say Berkeley activists, I think it's important to remember there were many hundred, maybe 1,000 students outside Yiannopoulos peacefully protesting. And 40 people organized with things to throw. They had bags full of bricks and stuff and Molotov cocktails. We don't know who they were. Were they opposed to Yiannopoulos? Maybe. Maybe they're people who get too crazy and want to do that kind of stuff. But they also could have been on the same side setting up a photo op for Fox, because it worked brilliantly. You do not want that mistaken for you. So if you try and deny someone a platform, we know who has the power to deny platforms. We can do a little of it, and if that's the principle, the other side will do far more, and we will lose out. We will not be able to express our opinions. We can't let them have theirs. We sure as hell are not going to get to do ours. have some confidence, calm down, and take them on the level of ideas and win.
I just want to say, just in terms of the effectiveness, what you do is you change the conversation from the validity of your ideas to the tactic you used. So people are no longer discussing, the question of Israel versus Palestine or the question of civil rights or whatever the question of the day is. They're discussing whether you should have blocked the highway so people couldn't get home, whether you should have blocked the bridge so ambulances couldn't go by, whether you should have allowed the people to speak. It's stupid to keep changing the topic away from the one you really want to have discussed and change people's minds about. So that's my thought.
Thank you all so much. So we just have time for one more question before we move to audience Q&A. And this question is also open to anyone that would like to answer. Throughout our conversation today, we've seen that clearly the FSM and activism in general holds incredible personal significance throughout your lives, not just as a student, but also through the rest of your lives. How has being a part of a massive student movement impacted your experience of life?
Well, I'll just say I taught it. I taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz for 40 years, more than 40 years. And my introduction to feminisms class was really an exercise in political thinking. I never imposed views on the students, but I used my experience as a political activist in order to encourage students to empower themselves, and in particular, of course, women. In the women's liberation movement. That was the sort of the start of women's studies and where I started teaching. And this course on feminism and social justice that I've taught online that you mentioned in the introduction, so it's done through the Mass Online Learning Program that's at the University of California, and it's on the Coursera platform, which is a global platform. And I was very resistant to teaching this class on feminism and social justice, but the whole class, online, I taught it in person at the university for about 10 years. And it's all about social justice movements and the role that women played in those social justice movements and the role of how those social justice movements worked and didn't work and what was involved in them, starting in the 1950s in the United States. So that was the point of the class. So they finally convinced me to do it online. I'm an old fogey. I thought you had to teach in person and not teach online. But I did 4 lectures, which is what they told me to do. And as of Monday, that's yesterday, we had 121,123 or something students that are taking this class. They are all over the world. They are on literally every continent, and I have corresponded with them on email, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, and I have Zoomed with them, with women in Pakistan, Kazakhstan, Iran, to Tehran. I did a whole podcast on women's history with a student in Tehran. So the technology has been incredible, and it's been inspiring for me, and I just want to say, I would never, the free speech movement was in my blood, you know what I mean? That's who I am. and so that's how I've taught. And again, without insisting that anybody agree with me, I always tell the students, you can disagree with me, just engage, just critically think, just engage. And so teaching that's what I would say. And it's still running on Coursera. You can still access it. Feminism and social justice. I had no idea this was going to happen. It was the most extraordinary experience. And what beautiful global feminist movements are going on. Let me tell you, the world is afire with them in all these different continents and all these different experiences and all the struggles that women are engaged in, especially against violence and especially for education. Thank you.
Well, this is a funny time of the year to respond to this, because my feeling at this moment is probably more pessimistic and negative about the world and where it's going than at any time in my life, and about the country too. But that being said, until very recently, I think the effect on my life was twofold. First of all, it made me maintain an optimism about what you could accomplish if you tried against large forces. So that we were, came out of the, oh, you want to see that happen? Well, go ahead and do it, or try to organize it, or join a group that's already trying to do it. But it was like,